The morning air was cold and sharp as I stepped outside my small apartment in a crowded city neighborhood. It was 1933, and the world I once knew was unrecognizable. Shops stood shuttered, factories silent, and the streets were filled with faces drawn tight by worry and exhaustion. My family, like so many others, was caught in the relentless grip of the Great Depression. My father had been a proud factory worker before the crash, but now he spent days pacing the floor, searching for work that didn't exist. My mother patched clothes by candlelight, trying to stretch every penny as we scraped together what little food we had. The pantry was often bare, and hunger was a constant dull ache. Days blurred together, job lines that stretched around blocks, waiting hours in hope and desperation. At the soup kitchen, the scent of thin stew mixed with quiet prayers for something better. Yet even in those dark days, life found moments of stubborn light. My sister and her friends stood on picket lines demanding fair treatment, their voices raw but unyielding. In the parks, young men and women found work planting trees or building roads through government programs that promised relief. I took what work I could, fixing roads, cleaning debris, grateful for any purpose, any pay. Slowly, the city began to breathe again. New construction projects rose, small businesses reopened, and there was talk of recovery. The radio was our lifeline. President Roosevelt's calm voice reached into our homes, assuring us that we were not forgotten, that a new deal was underway to restore hope and justice. Still, the struggle was relentless. Some nights, despair settled heavy. Friends and neighbors succumbed to illness or gave up entirely. I remember walking home once, stomach aching, wondering if things would ever improve. But we held on. We found strength in community, in shared stories, in helping neighbors, in small acts of kindness. Then, as if the years of hardship weren't enough, the world plunged into war. News from Europe was grim, and when Pearl Harbor was attacked, everything changed overnight. Factories roared back to life, but now, with the hum of tanks and planes. Women stepped into roles once reserved for men, proving their strength and resilience. I was drafted and sent far from home, clutching letters that connected me to my family and to hope. Nurses like Margaret worked tirelessly, stitching wounds, soothing fears, and reminding us all what we fought to protect. When the war ended, the country was forever changed. Returning home, I saw a nation ready to rebuild, not just buildings, but lives. New schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods rose from the ashes of hardship. The promise of education and opportunity blossomed through programs like the GI Bill. Looking back, I understand now what those years really meant. The Great Depression was more than poverty and loss. It was a test of our spirit and resilience. It taught us the value of community, the power of hope, and the strength to endure. Living through those times wasn't easy. It was raw, painful, and often lonely. But it was also a story of survival, courage, and ultimately, renewal. That's how it was to live through the Great Depression, a journey from darkness into the dawn. New York City, October 1929. It was a Thursday morning, crisp and golden, the kind of autumn day that made the air smell like money. From the window of his office on the 21st floor of the Equitable Trust Building, Thomas Whitmore could see the jagged spires of the skyline slicing into a sky so clear it could have been cut from crystal. Down on Wall Street, people moved like ants, busy and confident, faces flushed with purpose. The market had been jittery all week, but no one was panicking. Not really. Stocks dipped, stocks soared. That was the game, wasn't it? Thomas adjusted the cuffs of his navy suit and stepped away from the glass, reaching for his hat. He was 38 years old, a man of moderate wealth and immense optimism. A decade earlier, he'd started with a borrowed $100 and an instinct for trends. Now, he had an office with mahogany furniture, a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, and a wife who hosted luncheons for people named Vanderbilt and Astor. He didn't know, as he took the elevator down to the lobby, that history had just drawn in its breath. That before the sun set, fortunes would evaporate, lives would derail, and the very concept of American prosperity would be shattered like glass on a marble floor. A mile north, in a brownstone on East 65th Street, Nora Whitmore leaned over a newspaper, circling items on a list. The maid Martha cleared breakfast dishes with quiet efficiency, and across the dining table, her son Henry practiced French irregular verbs in a barely audible mumble. Nora was thinking about dinner party menus and wondering whether she had enough imported champagne in the cellar when she heard it. The sound of something not quite right. It was subtle at first, a siren perhaps, but sustained. Then two, then three. A phone rang from the next room, then another. The housekeeper's radio, always playing something cheerful in the mornings, abruptly went silent. The silence rang louder than music ever could. Down on Wall Street, the stock market was falling, not dipping, not correcting, falling, free falling. Thomas stepped out of a taxi at the corner of Broad and Wall just in time to see a man in a bowler hat hurl his briefcase against a granite wall. Papers flew into the wind like wounded birds. The man didn't even look up, just stared at the ground as if it had betrayed him. Crowds gathered in front of the New York Stock Exchange, pressing against the iron gates. The atmosphere was electric, hysterical. A man shouted, "Steel's down to 80. Another yelled back, "It was 260 last week." The ticker tape lagged, hopelessly behind the avalanche of selling orders. Phones rang endlessly. Brokers screamed into receivers, faces pale with fear. Thomas pushed his way into the exchange, the noise inside a crescendo of panic. The air was thick with sweat and desperation. There were no buyers, only sellers, each trying to escape the collapse, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. At his station, his partner Harold looked like he hadn't blinked in 20 minutes. "Tom," he gasped, "United States Steel just dropped 20 points in 10 minutes. Banks are pulling. Railroads are toast. This is it. This is the big one." Thomas stood frozen. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He had told clients for months that the market would stabilize, had borrowed against his own stocks to invest more, to double down. The crash in March had scared people, but things bounced back. They always did, didn't they? He rushed to the phones. There were 15 calls on hold, and the light for line 16 blinked red. He picked up at random. "Thomas Whitmore," he said. A woman's voice, Mrs. Greenwald, elderly widow, nice woman, crackled with static. "Thomas," she said, "should I sell? I'm hearing things, horrible things. What's happening?" Thomas stared at the pit, where men clawed at each other for non-existent buyers. His throat went dry. He wanted to lie, to say, "Don't worry, everything's fine," but the words stuck. He whispered, "I don't know, Mrs. Greenwald. I don't know." The day wore on. The market hemorrhaged billions. Between Monday and Thursday, $10 billion in wealth vanished. On Friday, a group of bankers tried to stabilize things by pouring money into the exchange, but it was like pouring water into a burning house. On Monday, panic returned. Tuesday was the worst day of them all. Black Tuesday. The market dropped 13% in a single day. $30 billion gone, 10 times the federal budget. America's prosperity, confidence, and illusion of invincibility crumbled in a matter of hours. Out in Nebraska, on a small tenant farm near North Platte, a man named Clyde Johnson didn't know what the Dow Jones was. He didn't own a single stock, didn't read the Wall Street Journal, didn't care much for bankers or cities. But by the end of the week, his world was already starting to crack. The mill where he sold his wheat had closed unexpectedly. The bank that held his mortgage was evaluating its liquidity, which meant they'd stopped answering the phone. His neighbor Harold, a quiet man with 4 kids and a team of mules, came by late at night just to talk. They say there's nothing left, just gone. Banks, savings, everything. Clyde chewed on a piece of straw and stared at the ground. You ever think it could be this bad? Harold shook his head. Nope, not in this country. Back in New York, Thomas couldn't go home that night. The brokerage firm had locked its doors from the inside. Men slept on the floor of the office, drinking from flasks, whispering horror stories. Someone claimed to have seen a banker leap from a window uptown. Another said 5 brokers had already disappeared. In the dark, under the low glow of a desk lamp, Harold finally broke the silence. I had 10,000 in bonds, Tom. Gone. My wife doesn't know yet. Thomas said nothing. He was thinking about Nora and their son and the dinner party that was supposed to happen next Thursday. He thought about the green-walled widow and how he had told her just last month that her portfolio was ironclad. He knew now that iron rusts. The ripple spread quickly. Factories closed, banks failed. Within weeks, millions of people across the country began to realize that their jobs, their homes, and their futures were built on sand. In Chicago, a meatpacking plant laid off 700 men with 1 day's notice. In Los Angeles, a line of cars stretched 4 blocks outside a soup kitchen. In Pittsburgh, a steelworker watched as the mill gates were locked, this time for good. In Harlem, a jazz musician pawned his saxophone to pay rent, then never got it back. In Boston, a school teacher asked her students to bring in coal for the classroom stove because the district couldn't afford fuel. And in homes across the country, families sat silently at dinner tables doing math in their heads. How long until we lose the house? How much is left in the bank? What will we do next? Nora Whitmore finally saw it with her own eyes on October 30th. Thomas came home early that day, early and broken. His hands trembled as he unbuttoned his coat. She had been in the parlor, arranging flowers, when he collapsed into the chair with a sigh that sounded like a death rattle. "We're finished," he said. "It's all gone." She didn't speak. She simply walked across the room and sat beside him. She rested her hand on his. And in that small gesture, something unspeakable passed between them. An ending. An end to the housekeepers, the fine dinners, the wine lists, an end to certainty. For the first time in her life, Nora realized that wealth had never belonged to them. It had simply passed through their hands for a while, like smoke or wind. By the end of 1929, over 650 banks had failed. Unemployment began to climb. Hoover's reassurances, the fundamentals of the economy are sound, began to ring hollow. Bread lines formed in cities, while farmers watched their fields dry up and their loans come due. No one called it the Great Depression yet. That would come later. For now, it was simply the crash. The moment the music stopped. The moment when the lights went out on the Roaring Twenties and didn't come back on for a very long time. And in the silence that followed, a new America began to take shape. Not the one of dreams and boomtowns and ticker tapes, but of survival, reinvention, and grit. The old world was gone. The new one had not yet arrived. Only the dust remained, and the question that would haunt a generation. What do you do when everything you believed in disappears? Winter came early in 1930. By mid-January, the streets of Chicago were dusted in snow, and the wind bit at the faces of anyone foolish enough to linger outside too long. But linger they did. Men lined up for blocks outside soup kitchens with their coat collars turned up and their hands buried deep in threadbare gloves, waiting for bread, stew, anything warm. Their breath came out in white puffs, and they shifted from foot to foot, not speaking much. There wasn't much left to say. Jacob Rosen stood in one of those lines, staring ahead at nothing. A month ago, he was an accountant at Granger & Co., a small but respectable firm, nestled in the heart of the Loop. He wore suits tailored in New York, carried a pocket watch passed down from his grandfather, and believed hard work was a contract America never broke. Now, he was in line for stale bread and a thin cup of soup served from a dented pot. The first time he came, he couldn't even look the volunteers in the eye. He'd skipped 3 meals and nearly passed out on the street before guilt gave way to hunger. Now, like so many others, he returned without hesitation, his pride reduced to ash by the slow burn of poverty. Behind him stood a young boy in a patched coat 3 sizes too big. He couldn't have been more than 12. Jacob looked down, offered a weak smile. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy looked up. "Sammy. Your folks with you?" The boy shook his head. "Pa went west, looking for work. Ma got sick. I'm by myself now." Jacob felt the pit in his stomach deepen, and it wasn't from hunger. He turned back to the front of the line and tightened his grip on his coat. When they finally reached the front, a woman in a flour-dusted apron handed them each a tin bowl and ladled watery soup into it. 2 slices of bread followed. No one complained. They found space on the curb, ate in silence. The only sound was the slurping of soup and the occasional cough. Jacob looked around at the line that still stretched far behind him. Some men wore business shoes with cardboard soles. Others wrapped their feet in newspaper. Faces were hollow, eyes downcast. These were not drunks or wanderers. These were men who once held jobs, paid mortgages, read newspapers with their morning coffee. Now they ate from charity pots and watched their dignity dissolve like sugar in rain. 1,000 miles away, in a quiet corner of Ohio, Margaret Holloway wiped her hands on her apron and leaned over the counter of Holloway's general store. It was nearly noon, and no one had come in all morning. Her husband, Al, sat near the pot-belly stove, reading the same newspaper he'd been poring over for days. The headline hadn't changed. Markets collapse. Banks struggled to recover. Each morning brought more failures. Local banks, regional railroads, steel companies, chain stores, giants falling like dominoes. "I should start taking credit again," Margaret said, her voice tight. Al shook his head. "We did that all last fall. We never saw half of it again. They'll pay us when they can. They'll never pay us because they'll never get it." She looked at the shelves. Sugar, flour, nails, soap. Supplies that used to vanish by the week now sat untouched. Even the children stopped coming in for penny candy. Not because they didn't want it, but because pennies had vanished from pockets like coins tossed into a deep well. Margaret walked to the window and watched as the wind carried a dusting of snow down Main Street. Across the road, the bank stood like a tombstone, cold, silent, foreboding. A line had started forming there too. "Again," she said. Al didn't answer. He didn't need to. She knew what it meant. A run. The Holloways watched helplessly as townspeople flooded into the bank, desperate to withdraw savings that likely didn't exist anymore. In the wake of the crash, panic was contagious. Rumors spread faster than facts. If one person said the bank was about to close, 30 more came running, afraid they'd be left with nothing. Inside the bank, John Mathers, manager for 17 years, stood behind the counter and tried to calm the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, your money is safe. You'll all be able to withdraw in good time. There's no reason for fear." But there was no stopping it now. An elderly man began pounding his cane on the floor. A mother sobbed as she clutched her baby. A factory worker shouted that he'd seen another bank lock its doors in Cleveland just last week. Mathers opened the vault and began handing out money. Not because it was smart, because it was the only thing he could do to prevent a riot. By sundown, the vault was empty. By morning, the bank was closed for good. In the weeks that followed, Margaret saw her neighbors fall, one by one. The Taylor farm went first, then the Vincents. Their daughter Ellen came into the store barefoot one afternoon, asking if they could trade eggs for flour. Margaret gave her a sack and told her to bring the eggs tomorrow. They never came. Some nights, Margaret would find a jar of pickled beets or a small sack of potatoes left anonymously on the back step. A quiet thank you, she supposed, from someone too proud to speak. She stopped keeping a ledger. What was the point? Money had become a ghost. People paid in sacks of coal, boots, hand-stitched gloves. Once, a boy left a drawing of her store, meticulously shaded in charcoal, every shelf perfectly recreated. It was the best payment she'd ever received. In New York City, the banks fell like dominoes. By the end of 1930, over 1,300 banks across the country had closed. People withdrew their life savings in panic, stuffing cash under mattresses or sewing it into coat linings. With no deposits, banks couldn't loan. With no loans, businesses couldn't operate. Without jobs, people stopped spending. The spiral deepened. In the city's poorer neighborhoods, men knocked on doors offering to sweep sidewalks for a piece of bread. Tenants doubled up in single apartments. Landlords stopped collecting rent because there was nothing left to take. At night, the parks filled with the jobless. Newspaper blankets, shoe polish fires. Entire shantytowns sprang up. Hoovervilles, they called them, named bitterly after President Hoover, whose inaction turned frustration into fury. At first, Thomas Whitmore tried to keep up appearances. He wore the same suits, kept the same posture, told Nora that things were tight but manageable. But as the weeks passed and the firm collapsed under lawsuits and unpaid debts, the illusion became impossible to maintain. The apartment on East 65th was sold. The maid was let go. The champagne dried up. By February, they were living in a one-bedroom walk-up above a bakery, the scent of burnt rye, their new perfume. Henry left private school and enrolled in a public one where half the kids wore the same jacket all year. Nora took in sewing work, her delicate hands blistered by coarse fabric. And Thomas, for the first time in his adult life, stood in line at the Employment Bureau with hundreds of others. Resume folded neatly, suit worn thin at the elbows. That spring, Jacob Rosen got a job through a charity, bookkeeping for a church in exchange for room and board. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him something to do, something to be. One evening, he passed a bakery and saw a help wanted sign. He pushed the door open and found himself face to face with a girl in a flour-covered apron. "Can you knead dough?" she asked. "Not unless numbers count," she laughed. "We could use a numbers man too. You want to learn?" He nodded. That night, he returned to the church with his hands smelling of yeast and the feeling, for the first time in months, that things might not be over yet. By the end of 1931, bread lines had become a part of American life. In Detroit, they snaked for miles. In Kansas, children sat quietly outside Red Cross depots, waiting for bags of flour. People no longer asked if things would get better, they just asked how long they could last. But even in the worst of it, Kindness sparked in unexpected places. Strangers shared food. Neighbors pooled savings. Churches opened their basements. A citywide program in St. Louis taught laid-off factory workers how to grow rooftop gardens. In Chicago, a barber gave free haircuts on Sundays. In a small Ohio town, Margaret Holloway's store kept feeding people, ledger or not. People learned to survive, not with money, but with each other. And survival in a time like this was everything. Western Kansas, spring 1931. The land had once sung. That's what Ruth Parker's grandmother used to say. Back when the fields rolled green and proud, when the rains came in whispers, and the wheat rose like gold toward heaven, back when a man could work the soil and sleep at night, knowing the next morning would bring purpose, harvest, and hope. But now, the land didn't sing anymore. It groaned, it cracked, it died. Ruth stood at the edge of the Parker farm, with her youngest daughter, Lily, clutching her apron. The girl's small fingers twisted in the fabric as she looked out at the fields. Nothing moved. Not even the wind dared to stir the parched earth. The topsoil was crusted brown as burnt bread. A few crooked stalks reached skyward like pleading arms, dry and brittle. The sun was high, punishing and colorless. There hadn't been proper rain in over 9 months. Just dust, the kind that seeped through closed windows and settled in the seams of your clothing. Ruth had long since stopped trying to keep the house clean. What was the point? The dust always won. Inside the farmhouse, Harold Parker sat, hunched over a chipped coffee mug, staring into black liquid that no longer held warmth. He hadn't shaved in a week. His hands, once calloused from work, now idle, trembled slightly. The radio hadn't worked in 3 days, and he didn't have the strength to fix it. The farm ledger lay open beside him, but the numbers no longer made sense. Debts, missed payments. The bank in Dodge City had stopped responding to letters. Harold looked up as Ruth walked in. "Ground's cracked over by the north plot," she said. He nodded slowly, eyes unfocused. "Ain't rained since Lily's birthday." "That was September." Harold sighed. "Feels like a decade." 2 years earlier, the Parkers had been doing fine. Not rich, but stable. Wheat prices had dipped, sure, but they had 160 acres, a pair of healthy mules, and a Ford truck that still ran well enough to get into town for supplies. They bought on credit like everyone else. Promised themselves it would all come back. Next year, next season, after the next rain. But the rains never came. And the wind, oh, the wind stayed. In 1930, the drought deepened. By 1931, the earth began to shift beneath their boots. Dust devils coiled like smoke across the plains. Entire crops withered before they even had a chance to root. The wheat fields turned to powder, and what didn't die in the heat was eaten alive by swarms of grasshoppers so thick they darkened the sky. The bank sent a notice in February. The Parkers owed $216 in back mortgage payments, another $90 for equipment loans. They were given 90 days to settle the debt. Harold sold the last of the pigs, then the mules. In April, he tried to plant again, wheat barely, and a small patch of potatoes. He borrowed a neighbor's tractor and spent 2 days fighting the wind and the dust to seed the dry ground. By May, it was all dead. Lily coughed in her sleep. Ruth sat beside her, brushing strands of light hair from the girl's forehead. She listened to the shallow wheezing and reached for a handkerchief. The cough had started 2 weeks ago, dry, persistent. Ruth had read something about dust pneumonia in a copy of the Topeka Weekly that blew into the yard last week. There were pictures. Children wearing cloths tied over their faces like robbers, their eyes red and watering. Ruth looked at her daughter and whispered, "You're not going to die here." She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. Harold drove into town on the first Sunday of June, wearing his best shirt, starched and pressed as well as he could manage. The truck coughed the whole way, gasping over cracked earth like it had lungs full of ash. Dodge City was quiet when he arrived. The store shelves were half empty. The feed shop was closed. Outside the bank, a man was sitting with his back against the door, holding a sign that read, "Bank took the farm wife, took the kids, nothing left to steal." Harold parked, took a deep breath, and went inside. The teller behind the desk didn't recognize him at first. "I'm Harold Parker," he said. "Got a letter about the farm." The teller nodded. "Yeah, you're 2 months overdue." "I've come to talk." The teller blinked slowly. "Talk about what?" "I've been a customer at this bank since 1922. Harold said, "I paid that mortgage every month for years. I just need more time. A season. Maybe 2. "I'm not the manager," the man replied. "He's not in today." Harold's voice rose slightly. "Then when will he be in?" "I don't know." The man turned and walked into a back room. Harold stood there for another 5 minutes, waiting, sweating. No one came back. That night, the wind returned. Not a breeze, not even a storm. Something worse. Silent, creeping, malevolent. Ruth was washing dishes when she saw it. A grey wall, crawling across the horizon. She ran outside. The chickens scattered, screaming. The sky turned copper, then black. She screamed for Lily, screamed again. Found the girl in the barn, hiding under a stool with a doll in her hand. "Come on, sweetheart. We need to get inside." The wind hit before they reached the porch. It came like an ocean wave, suffocating, deafening. Dust blasted their faces. It filled their mouths, their eyes, their ears. Ruth wrapped herself around Lily and forced the door open. Inside, Harold was nailing blankets to the windows. They lit a single oil lamp and huddled together in the kitchen. Outside, the world howled like it was in pain. The storm lasted for hours. When it passed, every surface in the house was coated in a thick layer of dirt. Dishes, pillows, their food, Lily's skin. Ruth cried as she cleaned her daughter's eyes with a damp rag. 2 days later, Harold made a decision. He stood at the edge of the field, hat clutched in his hand. The house was behind him, sagging like an old man's shoulders. The barn roof was caving in. The well was nearly dry. He knew what needed to be done. That evening, he told Ruth, "We're leaving." She looked at him, stunned. "Where?" "West California, maybe Oregon. They say there's work. Fruit orchards, vineyards. I'll pick grapes with my bare hands if I have to." Ruth bit her lip. "We don't even have money for gas." "I'll sell the truck. Get what I can. We'll ride the rails if we have to." Ruth stared at him. "And the house? The land?" Harold's voice cracked. "It's already gone." They left 2 weeks later, under a sky the color of lead. Harold carried a bag with the family Bible, 2 changes of clothes, and a tin of coins. Ruth held Lily's hand and wore her Sunday hat, though it was covered in dust. They didn't look back. Along the road, they saw others, dozens of them. Families with wagons, men on bicycles, women with children clinging to their skirts. America was on the move, not by choice, but by desperation. Some smiled as they passed, offering food, directions, warnings. Others didn't speak at all. They slept beneath stars, ate from strangers' kindness, rode in the back of trucks and boxcars, bumping against sacks of onions and crates of peaches. Once, a railroad cop tried to throw them off. Harold stood in front of his wife and child with clenched fists and refused to move. The man let them stay. By the time they reached the edge of California, Harold had lost 20 pounds. Lily's cough had softened. Ruth had new lines on her face, but in her eyes, a flicker of something remained. Resolve. They didn't find Eden when they arrived, but they found life. They found orchards, fields to work, a tent outside Modesto, where the nights were cold, but the ground was firm. And for the first time in a year, they ate fresh bread. The land back in Kansas eventually dried up entirely. Thousands more would leave. Thousands would stay. The Dust Bowl would continue through the decade, turning vast sections of America into a barren wasteland. But for the Parkers, and others like them, survival meant leaving everything behind and hoping that somewhere, anywhere, the land still remembered how to sing. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, autumn 1931. The iron smell of the steel mills still lingered in the air, even though the furnaces had gone cold months ago. Where there was once the rhythmic hum of machines and the roar of molten metal, there was now only silence. And silence, in a city like this, was a sound everyone feared. Danny Malone stood at the edge of the Monongahela River, skipping stones in the dark water. He had just turned 18, though there'd been no cake, no celebration, just a quiet nod from his father that morning and a muttered, "You're a man now," followed by a long stare out the window. His old man had once worked at the Jones and Laughlin plant, rising before dawn every day for 20 years. But ever since the layoffs, he mostly sat at the table, smoking roll-up cigarettes and thumbing through job notices that never panned out. Danny's coat was too short at the sleeves, his boots too loose. He used to care about things like how he looked, what his hair was doing, whether the girl across the alley smiled at him. Now, his main concern was whether the grocery down the block would have stale bread in the trash behind the store again. He crouched and picked up a flat rock, skimmed it low. 1, 2, 3 skips. Then it sank, just like everything else. Back in school, before everything fell apart, Danny had been something of a whiz with numbers. His math teacher, Mr. Holcomb, once told his mother, "This boy has a mind for accounting. With the right training, he could be a banker." At the time, Danny didn't even know what an accountant really did, but the idea of wearing a tie and sitting in a warm office all day sounded better than hauling slag or digging coal like his old man. But there was no more school, no more Mr. Holcomb. The building had shut down after the budget collapsed, and half the faculty left to find other work. Some of them never said goodbye. One day they were there, the next their desks were empty. Danny dropped another stone into the river and let the silence swallow it. Across town, his best friend Joey was packing. Joey Sullivan had decided to go west. He'd heard rumors, jobs picking apples in Washington, fishing boats in Oregon, even factories opening in California. It might have been all lies, but when you're sleeping on a floor with 6 brothers and no heat, even lies start to sound like salvation. Joey's ma cried when he told her. "What'll I do if you don't come back?" she said. He smiled weakly. "You'll have one less mouth to feed, Ma." Danny helped him tie the straps on his knapsack the night before he left. "You sure about this?" he asked. Joey nodded. "I can't just sit around waiting for the world to fix itself." "Well, you go first." "Gonna hop a freight train out of McKeesport? After that, wherever it stops, I guess." Danny wanted to say something hopeful, something like, "I'll come too," or "Maybe I'll catch up with you." But the words stuck. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, he said, "Don't fall asleep with your shoes off. They'll steal 'em right off your feet." Joey laughed. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." They hugged like brothers. Neither knew it would be the last time. In the tenement buildings that loomed like concrete cliffs across Pittsburgh, a generation was growing up with nothing to inherit. No jobs, no safety nets, no guarantees. Sally Donovan, who lived 2 floors down from Danny, used to dream about becoming a schoolteacher. She loved to read. She'd saved every penny she made, cleaning the McGarry's house on weekends to buy second-hand books, Keats, Dickinson, Shakespeare. But now the McGarrys had moved out, evicted when their father's construction company went under. Sally still read, though, mostly to her little brother Tommy, to keep him from crying when the hunger got too much. At night, she wrote in a small brown notebook with half the pages torn out. Today, Mama stood in line for 6 hours and got 2 tins of beans and a sack of rice. We boiled the rice until it was mush so it would stretch. I pretended it was stew. I miss school. I miss paper that isn't yellow and books that don't smell like mildew. I miss knowing what day it is. She kept the notebook under her mattress, safe from the damp and the rats. Across the country, young people like Sally and Danny were waking up to a world that had changed the rules without telling them. Dreams of college were traded for dreams of stable meals. Weddings were postponed indefinitely. Shoes were mended and worn until the soles fell off. Childhood ended, not with a ceremony, but with a whisper. Your family needs you now. Danny tried to help where he could. He took odd jobs when he found them, hauling scrap, shoveling snow, selling old newspapers to recyclers. Once, he helped an old man carry buckets of coal to his apartment and got paid with half a loaf of bread and a boiled potato. He ate it in the hallway. One day, while wandering downtown, he stumbled upon a crowd gathered in the square. A truck with a wooden platform had parked in front of the old courthouse, and a man in a rumpled suit was shouting into a megaphone. "Roosevelt is the man to fix this," he cried. "We need a new deal. The banks have failed us. The rich don't care if we starve. It's time for the working man to rise." The crowd murmured. Some cheered. Some scoffed. A few threw coins. Danny didn't know what to think. Politics seemed like a rich man's game, but something about the man's voice, how he didn't sound afraid, stuck with him. Afterward, Danny asked an older man in the crowd, "You really think things will change?" The man shrugged. "Hell if I know, but they can't stay like this." In early 1932, the city opened a work camp for young men outside of town. It paid 50 cents a day for clearing brush, laying drainage ditches, and repairing public roads. Danny signed up immediately. The work was brutal. 10 hours a day with barely enough to eat. But it was honest. He came home each night exhausted, but proud, with blisters on his hands and sweat in his shirt. He gave his mother most of his pay, kept just enough for bus fare and the occasional chocolate bar for his little sister. Once, after 3 weeks on the job, he bought a used necktie for a nickel. It was red, slightly faded, but still sharp. "I'll wear it to my real job someday," he told his sister, trying to sound confident. She smiled with her few remaining baby teeth. "You'll be the boss of something." Later that year, Sally's father disappeared. He'd gone out one morning to look for work in the Strip District and never came back. Some said they saw him hopping a train headed west. Others said he'd checked himself into a hospital for the sick and the poor. Sally's mother stopped talking for 3 days. Sally took over the house. She cleaned. She rationed. She sold her books, one by one. By summer, the only thing left was a tattered copy of Jane Eyre and her journal. She never sold the journal. One day, she passed a storefront and saw a notice on the window. WPA hiring typists, must pass literacy exam, age 17 plus. She was 16. She lied on the form. She got the job. 3 months later, she bought her little brother a new pair of shoes with the first real money she'd ever held. By the end of 1932, nearly a third of all young adults in America were out of work. Colleges slashed enrollments. Trade apprenticeships vanished. The dreams of a generation were traded for pickaxes and soup lines. But from the wreckage, something new began to stir. Danny saved enough to attend free night classes offered by the YMCA. He met a retired accountant who taught him how to balance ledgers and draft invoices. Danny soaked up every word. By winter, he was helping local vendors manage their books in exchange for groceries. Sally kept her WPA job. She started writing again, not just in her journal, but short stories. Some of them about a girl in a broken city who always found a way to smile. One of her stories made it into a small union newspaper. They paid her $1. She framed the check. And somewhere out west, in a dusty orchard beneath a pink sunset, Joey Sullivan picked apples and sang to himself to keep from going mad. His hands were cracked, his stomach ached, but he still carried a small picture in his pocket, his ma, taken with a borrowed camera just before he left. On the back, she had written, "Come back when the trees are green again." He looked at it every night and dreamed of spring. Spring 1932, Missouri. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon, but the cold steel wheels of the freight train already groaned to life in the yard outside Jefferson City. Long shadows stretched over the gravel lot as figures emerged from behind empty boxcars, sleepy, stiff, coughing in the mist of their breath. Tommy Haskell rubbed his eyes with dirty sleeves and rose from the makeshift nest he'd built from newspapers and straw. His ribs showed through his shirt, his hair matted from the night's chill. He was 17, or at least he thought so. The days had blurred, and the months were hard to count. His last birthday had been spent beneath a water tower in Topeka, trading sardines for matches. He used to live in a tidy two-bedroom house with his mother and 2 younger sisters. His father, a foreman at the lumber mill, had lost his job in 1930. By mid-1931, the house was gone, the furniture pawned, and the family scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Tommy had left to find work and send money home. That had been 8 months ago. So far, he hadn't earned more than $1 in any one place. He climbed up the side of the boxcar, gripping the iron rungs with calloused hands. Inside were 4 others already huddled in the shadows. An old man with a beard like tangled rope, a young black man with a harmonica, and a couple who looked barely out of their teens. They didn't speak. Nobody did at first. Everyone was tired of retelling their misfortunes. As the train jolted forward, Tommy settled into the straw and let the rhythm of the tracks carry him east. Hopping trains had become an American ritual of suffering. They called themselves Bindlestiffs, or Knights of the Road. Mostly men, but not always. Some were boys like Tommy, others grizzled Civil War veterans who had lived through one apocalypse and now wandered through another. Women rode too, some with children tucked beneath coats, some alone, armed with a knife in one boot and a rosary in the other. They crisscrossed the nation, riding the rails, following harvest seasons, rumors of work, whispers of shelter. By 1932, it was estimated that over 250,000 teenagers were riding the rails in search of jobs. America had become a country of transients. Every town, every state, every rail stop told a different story, but the chorus was the same. Nothing here, try further west. Tommy's journey took him through Springfield, then Tulsa, then Amarillo. He jumped from boxcars and rode under them, clinging to metal bars in the wind. He watched as sheriffs dragged people out of cattle cars, beat them with clubs, and left them bleeding in ditches. In Oklahoma, he shared a fire with a man named Clyde, who'd once owned a piano shop. Clyde had been a concert pianist in Chicago before the crash. Now, he played for food in migrant camps and tuned instruments for church choirs in exchange for shelter. "My fingers still remember Mozart," Clyde said one night, warming his hands over an oil drum fire, "but now they play for beans." In New Mexico, Tommy met Rosie, a red-haired girl in overalls who'd run from an orphanage in Illinois. She carried a satchel full of postcards, blank ones, on which she wrote imaginary letters to herself. "Dear Rosie," she would read aloud by the firelight, "today you woke up to the sound of gulls. The sea was just outside your door, and breakfast smelled like cinnamon." Tommy had kissed her once, under a bridge outside Las Cruces. The next morning, she was gone, just like most people on the road. Farther west, the migrants became more numerous, and the welcome colder. In California, whole towns had formed on the outskirts of cities. Hoovervilles with names like Little Oklahoma or Texas Town. Cardboard and tin shanties lined dry riverbeds. Families lived in tents, cooked over open fires, and lined up for day labor that paid 10 cents an hour, if anything. The locals resented them. Signs appeared in shop windows. No Okies, no bums, no handouts. Police blocked state lines, turning away migrants with clubs and guns. Some places passed vagrancy laws that jailed the homeless for loitering. In San Jose, men slept in orchards at night and hid from foremen during the day, hoping for work that never came. But still, they came. From the Dust Bowl, from the coal towns, from Detroit and St. Louis and rural Georgia. They came in broken-down Model Ts, in boxcars, on foot. They carried children, wounded dreams, and photographs of home. They came because standing still was a death sentence. Tommy eventually reached the Central Valley. There, he joined a crew of men picking peaches under a scorching sun. He was paid 5 cents a bushel. A good day earned him 25 cents. He gave half to the foreman for food, usually beans and old bread, and kept the rest in his sock. The work was brutal. 10-hour days, no shade, cuts on his fingers that never healed, but it was something. It gave his body purpose and dulled the ache in his heart. He slept on the ground beside the others, his bag under his head. Sometimes he dreamed of his mother's kitchen, the smell of frying bacon, the sound of the radio playing jazz. Other nights, he dreamed of Rosie and the postcard letters she read by firelight. In the camp, men told stories to pass the time. "Back home, I had a house with a porch," one said. "Now I'd settle for a roof that don't leak." "My boy was going to be a doctor," another whispered. "Now he's out here, same as me, digging holes for lettuce." I saw a man trade his boots for a can of peaches. Tommy listened and nodded. Everyone had lost something. For some, it was their house. For others, it was their pride. Not all stories ended in despair. One morning, as the sun rose behind the Sierra Nevada, a man arrived in camp with a clipboard and a starched shirt. He was from the Farm Security Administration, a government agency trying to organize camps for displaced workers. "They're building new housing out near Bakersfield," he announced. "Tents with floors, clean water, showers." The men murmured. Some laughed. "Don't lie to us," one growled. But it was true. The next week, trucks came. Tommy climbed into the back of one and rode to a new camp, a clean one with communal kitchens, medical care, and a library. It wasn't home, but it was better than the dirt. At night, under electric lights strung between poles, he read books for the first time in years. The camp had a teacher who showed the young men how to write letters again, how to balance a ledger, how to think beyond the next meal. Tommy started writing home again. He didn't know if the letters reached his mother, but it made him feel less alone. Elsewhere, in states far from the orange groves and irrigation ditches, others moved too, on foot, in hope, and out of necessity. On Route 66, an entire generation followed the asphalt ribbon west. Hitchhikers crowded the shoulders. Children slept in car trunks. Families made camp beneath highway billboards promising luxury goods they could no longer name. In the Carolinas, thousands of sharecroppers packed up and headed north, chasing factory jobs that didn't exist. In Chicago, out-of-work teachers migrated to Iowa to pick corn. In Idaho, old miners returned to the hills, hoping to strike something the banks couldn't steal. Everyone was moving. No one had a destination, just momentum. In Bakersfield, Tommy met a man named Joe Nance, who taught him how to weld. Joe had been a mechanic before the crash and still wore a pair of grease-stained overalls that he refused to wash, calling them his badge of survival. "You're good with your hands," Joe said. "Maybe you ought to stick with this." Tommy practiced every day. By the end of the summer, he could solder a joint tight and clean. It was the first skill he could trade for real wages. He wrote to his mother again. "Dear Ma, I got a job, a real one, building irrigation pumps. It ain't much, but I can buy my own food now. I hope you and the girls are safe. I'll send money soon." He sealed the letter with fingers burned from the arc of the torch. It was the first time he felt like the future might not be lost after all. The country kept moving, from city to city, job to job, camp to camp. Some people vanished in the shuffle. Others found new purpose. All of them carried the same story, rewritten in different places by different hands. And though the road was long, and the dust thick, and the nights cruel, America's travelers kept walking. Because somewhere, just over the next hill, they believed something better waited, even if it didn't. Detroit, Michigan, summer 1932. The heat hung heavy over the city like a damp blanket that couldn't be shaken. Concrete radiated warmth back into the air long after the sun set, and even at night, the streets steamed. The air buzzed with the sound of fans, dogs barking, and babies crying through open windows. Inside a tenement on the east side of town, Margaret Landry sat by the kitchen table, illuminated only by the flickering yellow light of a single kerosene lamp. She dipped her pen into a glass bottle of ink and began to write. "Dear James," she began, her handwriting slow but steady, "we're still holding on, somehow. I sold the radio last week, didn't want to, but the grocer stopped giving us credit. I got $6 for it. Bought potatoes, a jar of jam, some rice, and a sack of flour. I think I stretched it enough to last us 2 weeks." Her hand trembled slightly as she paused. She looked over her shoulder at the couch in the corner where her 2 youngest boys, Thomas and George, slept side by side, using one blanket. Their small forms barely moved under the cloth. Their bellies were full, barely, and she would count that as a win. "The boys ask about you every day. Tommy still thinks you're coming home on his birthday. I didn't have the heart to tell him that's not likely. But maybe you will. Maybe something will come through. Maybe you'll find work out there." She swallowed hard. "I miss you, more than words allow. I hope this finds you, wherever you are." She signed it. "Your Margaret." She didn't know exactly where James was. When he left for Chicago 6 months ago, it was with the promise of a job on the South Side, laying concrete for a new city block. The job dried up in 2 weeks. The last letter he sent came from Springfield, Illinois, postmarked March 4th. In it, he promised to keep writing. That was 4 months ago. But Margaret wrote to him every week anyway. She addressed the envelopes to towns he'd mentioned in passing, Peoria, St. Louis, Joliet, carefully printing forward if known beneath his name. She dropped them off at the corner mailbox and waited, hoping. The post office had become more than a place to send mail. It was a shrine of sorts. A place where thousands of broken families left prayers scrawled on envelopes and hoped some stranger behind a metal slot would carry them to the right door. In a mail depot outside Topeka, Kansas, Sam Feller stood behind a long wooden counter, sorting through a mound of returned letters. He was a postal clerk, 60 years old, grizzled and tired-eyed, with ink stains on his fingertips, and a silver pocket watch he checked every hour like a nervous habit. The pile of dead letters, envelopes returned to sender for lack of address, recipient unknown, insufficient postage, was growing by the week. Most of them had little hearts drawn on the back flaps, or words like "please forward" or "important," scribbled in childlike handwriting. Many were addressed to Camp near Route 40 or John Miller, last seen near El Paso. Sam couldn't throw them away. He read them sometimes, late at night, after the other clerks had gone home. He wasn't supposed to, but how could he not? One read, "Mama, I got a job picking apples. I'm sending $2 with this letter. I hope you get it. I miss Daisy. I'll come back when I can." Another, "Dear Clara, if this letter reaches you, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have left the way I did. I think of you every day. I don't drink anymore." He sorted them into a shoebox he kept in his desk drawer. He called it America's Orphans. Out in Nevada, a boy named Eli wrote to his brother from a tent city outside Reno. He used a pencil stub and the back of an old church flyer. "Hey Jack, if you're out there, I'm here with Ma. We found a place near the railroad. There's beans every night, and a guy named Fred plays the harmonica. It's not so bad. I still have your knife, still sharp." He folded the letter and gave it to a traveler headed east. "Drop it in a mailbox if you can," he said. The man nodded and tucked it into his coat. That's how most letters traveled now, not just through stamps and postmarks, but through handoffs and promises, carried by strangers from one lost corner of the country to another. In California, letters piled up at the migrant camps. The camp near Modesto had a tin mailbox nailed to a wooden post at the edge of the field. A single postman arrived once a week in a rickety truck, bringing letters tied with twine and returning with armfuls of new ones. Children waited for him like he was Santa Claus. Tommy Haskell, now working at an irrigation supplies shop nearby, visited the box every Friday. He hadn't heard from his family in over a year, but every week he wrote, "Dear Ma, I got work welding again. I can send $5 this time. Hope the girls are still in school. Tell them I think about them. Tell them I'm not lost. I'm working on coming home." He sealed the envelope and placed it gently into the tin box, knowing full well it might never arrive. Still, it was better than silence. It was a way to remain real. In a dusty library in Oklahoma, Sally Donovan was helping her younger brother write a letter to their father. The man had vanished a year earlier, but Tommy still believed he'd return. "Dear Daddy," Tommy dictated as Sally scribbled, "I have 2 teeth loose. I won a race. Sally made stew. Mama cries less now. I think you're working somewhere hot. I hope they feed you good. Love, Tommy." Sally folded the note, kissed it, and placed it in a red envelope she had saved since her birthday. They addressed it to Dad Donovan the Road. The librarian promised to mail it. The Great Depression was a story written in ink, postage, and hope. Letters connected the broken pieces of a nation. They carried love across deserts, sorrow across mountains, and prayers across train tracks. People read them under gaslight, in tents, in shacks, on train cars, beneath bridges. They were opened with trembling hands, and sometimes with tears. They were folded and tucked into shirt pockets like amulets. They were read again and again until the paper wore thin. Sometimes a letter arrived too late. Sometimes it never arrived at all. But the writing of it, that was something else. That was defiance. That was survival. That was saying, I'm still here. I still believe in you. I still believe in us. One day in November 1932, Margaret Landry opened her mailbox and found a letter. The handwriting was familiar. Inside was a single sheet, written in pencil. The words faded. Dear Margaret, I'm sorry for the silence. Been working in a mine up north. Hurt my leg. Took a while to get steady again. Still not much money, but I'm alive. I think about you and the boys every night. Tell Tommy I remember his birthday. I'll try to get home by Christmas. I swear. She pressed the paper to her lips. The boys watched as she cried, silent and shaking. Then she smiled. The first real smile in months, because sometimes a letter from nowhere was all you needed to remember that home still existed somewhere. New York City, winter 1932. The line outside the Bowery Mission wrapped around the corner and down Delancey Street. A river of worn coats, trembling hands, and hollow cheeks. Frost clung to the edges of scarves, and steam rose from mouths like ghosts trying to escape. No one spoke. Words cost energy. Energy required food, and there wasn't enough of either. Inside the mission, a pot of thin cabbage soup simmered over a wood stove. Volunteers moved quickly, ladling broth into dented tin cups, offering a chunk of hard bread with each portion. It wasn't enough, but it was something. At the very back of the line stood Clara Moretti, holding her little brother Paulie close beneath her coat. He was 9 years old and shivering, cheeks raw from windburn, eyes dull. Clara rubbed his arms, trying to transfer what little warmth she had. How much longer? He whispered. Not long now, she replied, though they still had 40 men ahead of them. Paulie had stopped asking for meat weeks ago. He no longer dreamed of hot stew or fresh eggs. He hoped only for warmth, something to fill the sharp ache in his belly. Hunger had become a constant companion, an invisible presence that followed him from sleep to waking and back again. Clara had lost 12 pounds since October. She knew this because her dress no longer fit. Her hip bones jutted through fabric. Her hands looked foreign, like old ladies' hands, thin and veined and trembling. They were orphans now. Their father had died of pneumonia the winter before. Their mother, worn to ash by grief and unpaid bills, had vanished in July. Perhaps to find work, perhaps to die. Clara didn't know. She didn't allow herself to wonder too long. Instead, she focused on survival. Each morning, she brought Paulie to the mission, then left to search for food. Sometimes she begged. Sometimes she waited near grocers and asked for bruised fruit. Once, she caught a rat and cooked it over a barrel fire. She told Paulie it was chicken. He didn't believe her, but he ate it anyway. Across the country, the story was the same. In Chicago, men lined up for soup, with arms crossed tight, their shoes wrapped in burlap to keep out snow. In Atlanta, women gathered in alleyways to share cans of beans between 5 or 6 mouths. In San Francisco, school teachers collected stale bread and handed it to students after class. The average American family had lost nearly half its income. Unemployment had reached 25%. But even those with jobs couldn't afford enough food. Bread lines became as common as fire hydrants. Grocery stores began chaining their dumpsters, and hunger moved in, not with a roar, but with a whisper. At first, it was missed meals. Then it was skipped meals. Then it was children fainting in classrooms. Then it was families quietly dying in rooms too ashamed to ask for help. In Kansas, the Phillips family lived on cornbread and lard. Their father, once a proud wheat farmer, now spent most of his days cutting firewood for pennies or trapping rabbits when he could find them. His wife, Anna, used to bake pies. Now she rationed sugar like gold, saving it for tea when the kids were sick. She had lost her wedding ring in a trade for powdered milk. Sometimes at night, she touched the empty space on her finger and cried silently beside the stove. Their eldest son, Jacob, was 13 and tall for his age. He was always hungry. His stomach growled in church. He often dreamt of butter. One evening, Jacob snuck into the neighbor's barn and stole a dozen eggs. He knew it was wrong. But when he brought them home, Anna didn't ask where they came from. She just whispered, "Thank you," and scrambled them with wild onions from the roadside. The children ate like kings that night. And the next morning, Jacob apologized at the neighbor's doorstep. The man, an old war veteran named Hal, looked him over and nodded. "You're a good boy," he said. "Next time, just ask." In Philadelphia, a boy named Samuel Levy tried to sell his coat for food. He stood on a street corner, holding a cardboard sign, "Wool coat for a sack of flour." People passed without looking. A man in a black overcoat finally stopped, looked Samuel over, and said, "You'll freeze without it." Samuel said, "Then I'll be warm on the inside." The man bought him soup instead, 2 bowls. Samuel cried while he ate. Hunger did strange things to people. In Salt Lake City, a man broke into a bakery and was caught stealing 8 loaves. He refused to run. When the police asked why he hadn't taken money instead, he said, "You can't eat money." In a North Carolina village, a group of mothers formed a kitchen circle. Each woman took turns cooking whatever they had, and they fed every child on the street together. One woman had a single hen, and she guarded it like a queen. In the Dakotas, families boiled dandelion greens and ate pancakes made of sawdust and flour. There were government pamphlets that taught people how to cook possum, squirrel, and even boiled weeds. Churches ran out of bread. Food banks ran out of food. The word starve re-entered the American vocabulary, not as metaphor, but as reality. But even amid that horror, something resilient flickered in the American soul. Communities organized penny dinners, 5-cent meals where no one was turned away. Barbers offered haircuts for apples. Farmers left baskets of corn by the roadside with signs that read, "Take what you need." In Oklahoma, a woman named Miriam crafted quilts from old overalls and sold them for eggs. Her quilts became so well known that local stores began displaying them in the window. "Hard times," she said, "ain't harder than I am." Back in New York, Clara managed to get Paulie into a school with a meal program. He received oatmeal each morning and a slice of bread at lunch. It wasn't much, but it allowed him to concentrate for the first time in weeks. Clara found work cleaning at a textile factory twice a week. It paid 75 cents a day. She used half to rent a small basement room from a widow named Miss Keeley, who let them sleep on straw mats and offered soup if she had enough. At night, Clara read to Paulie from books she found in trash bins. She'd once wanted to be a teacher. Now she taught her brother how to read, how to multiply, and how to imagine a world where hunger wasn't a daily guest. Sometimes when he was full, Paulie asked, "Do you think we'll always be hungry?" Clara would kiss his forehead and say, "No." And though she wasn't sure, she said it like a promise. In Washington, D.C., the government struggled to respond. Politicians argued over relief programs. The Hoover administration insisted the economy would fix itself. Bread riots broke out in Minneapolis and Cleveland. In Arkansas, families looted a Red Cross train. The tide was turning. Hunger wasn't just a tragedy, it was becoming a revolution. And all across the country, mothers like Clara, fathers like Mr. Phillips, and children like Samuel kept waking up, determined to survive one more day. Not because they were sure of a better future, but because they had no choice. Because when you've stared down hunger and lived, you understand that life, no matter how fragile, is still worth clinging to. Even in the hunger years. Washington, D.C., June 1932. The first tents went up along the Anacostia River in early May. Simple things made from tarps, army blankets, and sticks. By the end of June, they stretched for blocks, a ramshackle city of canvas, tin, and desperation. Smoke from barrel fires curled into the sky, mingling with the humid summer air and the scent of unwashed clothes, canned beans, and hope. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. The newspapers shortened it to the Bonus Army. They were veterans, men who had fought in France, who had crawled through the mud of the Marne, who had watched their friends bleed out on the banks of the Meuse. They'd returned from war with ribbons, medals, and promises. The promise they clung to now was the Adjusted Service Certificate, a bonus promised by Congress in 1924, meant to be paid in 1945. But 1945 was too far away. It was 1932. The banks had collapsed. The factories had shut their doors. Children were going hungry. These veterans, the so-called heroes, were now jobless, homeless, and desperate. So they marched from Pittsburgh, from Buffalo, from St. Louis, Chicago, Des Moines. Some came on foot, others hitchhiked, and many rode the rails. They brought their wives, their children, their service records, and sometimes just their memories. By the time June ended, over 17,000 veterans and their families were camped in the capital. Among them was Franklin "Red" Malloy, a lean man of 45, with rust-colored hair and a limp from a gunshot he'd taken at Chateau Thierry. He had once been a sergeant. Now, he slept beneath a tarp beside his 12-year-old son, Charlie, and a photograph of his late wife folded carefully in his coat pocket. "I've fought for this country," he often told other marchers around the fire. "I figure I earned what they owe me." The camps were organized like military units. Every man signed in at the headquarters tent, run by a stern but fair man named Walter Waters, a former Army sergeant from Oregon who had become the unofficial leader of the movement. He wore a brown cap, walked with a straight spine, and barked orders like a drill instructor. He kept discipline. No drinking, no fighting, no threats to the government. "We're here to protest, not to revolt," he told the men daily. Water stations were dug. Makeshift latrines were built. A field kitchen was assembled with donations from local sympathetic grocers and churches. Volunteer doctors offered free treatment under a canvas tent with a red cross scrawled in chalk. It wasn't paradise, but it was home. For now, Red Malloy kept a journal during those days. Each morning, after standing in line for bread and coffee, he'd sit on a flat rock near the river and write, "June 12th. Charlie said he misses Mama's corn cakes. I promised him I'd make them if we get our bonus." He smiled. First time I've seen him smile in weeks. June 14th. Another man arrived today, lost his leg in the Argonne, said he's been sleeping in train cars since January, took one look at our camp and cried. June 17th. Congress says they're voting soon. Some say they'll approve it. Some say no chance. We're trying to stay hopeful. God knows we've waited long enough. His handwriting was small and cramped, the pages dotted with raindrops and dirt. Charlie sometimes read them out loud when the other men gathered around. They called it the Sergeant's Dispatches. Back in the city, politicians grew nervous. President Herbert Hoover, holed up in the White House, refused to meet the marchers. He believed that giving in to their demands would bankrupt the nation. His advisors warned him, that the camp was a hotbed of communists and radicals. But that wasn't true. Most of the men had served faithfully, returned home quietly, and spent years building lives that were now in ruins. They weren't revolutionaries, they were fathers, patriots, survivors. In the Senate, a bill was introduced to pay out the bonuses early, immediately. It passed the House, but in the Senate, it stalled. And on June 17th, 1932, the Senate voted down the bill. The camp fell into silence as word spread. Men wept openly. Some shouted curses into the night. A few packed their bags defeated, but most stayed. They had nothing to return to. In the days that followed, tensions rose. The city of Washington, embarrassed and overwhelmed, ordered utilities cut to the camps. The water stopped, then the power. Rumors spread that Hoover was preparing to send in the police, or worse, the army. Still, the veterans held fast. They organized marches, peaceful ones. They sang songs from the trenches, recited the Pledge of Allegiance, and held banners that read, "We fought together, now let us live together." Red Malloy stood at the front of every march. His limp slowed him, but his pride kept him tall. Charlie walked beside him, waving a flag stitched from rags. One evening, Red wrote in his journal, June 26th. Charlie asked me what bravery meant. I told him it means standing for something even when the world tells you to sit down. But not everyone saw bravery. The press turned. Editorials called the marchers bums in uniform and threats to democracy. Hoover, under pressure from business leaders and nervous generals, made a decision that would stain his legacy forever. On July the 28th, 1932, just before dawn, federal troops moved in. It began with a roar. Columns of cavalry charged down Pennsylvania Avenue. Soldiers wearing gas masks lobbed tear gas into the camps. Infantrymen followed with rifles and fixed bayonets. They were led by General Douglas MacArthur, flanked by Major Dwight D. Eisenhower and a young George S. Patton, names that would later become famous in another war. The veterans believed it was a mistake. They thought the soldiers would join them, or at least pass peacefully. They were wrong. Flames lit the morning sky as tents were set ablaze. Tear gas swept through the streets. Children screamed. Old men collapsed in the smoke. One baby died of suffocation. Dozens of veterans were injured, hundreds arrested. Red Malloy tried to shield Charlie with his coat as they ran. They were separated in the chaos. It wasn't until evening that Red found him, coughing in an alley, eyes red and swollen. He clutched his father's journal, which he had saved from the flames. "I held on to it," Charlie whispered. "Like you said, I didn't drop it." Red hugged him tight. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. By nightfall, the camps were gone. Ashes drifted across the Anacostia. The bonus army was scattered, but the country had seen. Photographs of the assault ran in every newspaper. Veterans in tattered uniforms fleeing soldiers on horseback, a child weeping in the arms of his mother, smoke curling behind the Capitol dome. America recoiled, and in that recoil, something shifted. The 1932 election was months away. Hoover, already unpopular, now seemed cold, unfeeling, tyrannical. And across the nation, a new name was rising. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who promised a New Deal, a man who spoke of hope, of recovery, of government not as an enemy, but as a lifeline. Red Malloy and Charlie took a train to upstate New York that fall. They settled in a small town, living in a church basement. Red found work fixing fences and reading to elderly veterans at the VFW hall. He still limped, still wrote in his journal. And Charlie? He started school again. He wrote an essay titled, "The Summer I Learned What America Means." It won first prize. He read it at the county fair. and in the audience, Red wiped a tear from his cheek and thought, maybe the fight wasn't wasted after all. Oklahoma Panhandle, April 1935. The morning sky was a dull bronze, not from the rising sun, but from dust, so thick it coated the wind and turned the air into dry sandpaper. The ground trembled slightly with the hush of wind rolling in from the west, and every soul in the town of Boise City knew what was coming long before the first gust hit. Inside a sagging farmhouse 10 miles outside of town, 13-year-old Elsie Granger was already awake. She had been up before dawn, filling buckets with well water, nailing wet sheets over the window gaps, and helping her father shove rags under the door frames. Her fingers were raw, her eyes burned. Dust had already settled inside her nose. She hated the wind. It hadn't always been like this. Once, Oklahoma had smelled like wheat in summer, back when her father's fields danced gold beneath blue skies, back when her mother laughed while hanging clothes in the breeze. But that had been 4 years ago, before the storms came. Now, the land was dead. The storms had names now. Black blizzards, they were called. Monsters that rose from the earth and swallowed the sky whole. The worst one was still fresh in Elsie's memory. Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935. It had been like the end of the world. That Sunday had started with rare optimism. Churchgoers walked without masks. Farmers sat on porches sipping coffee. The wind had calmed, the air was almost clear, and mothers let their children play without damp kerchiefs tied over their faces. Elsie had helped her father rake the dust off the porch and spread water on the dry dirt near the windows. By 4 p.m., the black wall appeared on the horizon. It rose like a tidal wave, hundreds of feet high, solid as coal, churning with the fury of 1,000 plows. People screamed, horses bolted, chickens dropped dead in the yards, and the dust moved fast, faster than any man could run. Elsie remembered her father grabbing her, yelling over the wind. They dove into the cellar just as the house began to shake. Down in the blackness, with her mother holding her close, she could hear the storm scream like a train engine overhead. It lasted 10 minutes. 10 minutes that felt like a war. When they emerged, nothing looked familiar. Their barn had collapsed. The garden was gone. The sky was blood red. And a dead calf lay face down in the yard, its eyes caked shut with soil. And yet, they'd been lucky. Other families suffocated inside their homes. Children had died under sand-laden blankets. One woman had gone blind after rubbing her eyes too long with dirty hands. Dust was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a killer. The Dust Bowl wasn't a single event. It was years of hell, strung together by drought, bad luck, and human mistakes. In the 1920s, farmers had plowed under millions of acres of prairie grass in pursuit of wheat profits. Tractors tore up soil that had never been tilled. Trees were cut down. The roots that held the land in place vanished. Then came the droughts. Rain stopped. The sun bore down. Without the native grasses, the land crumbled. By the early 1930s, the wind had nothing to resist it, and so it carried the earth itself. In Kansas, the Rogers family buried their second child in 1934. Cause of death: dust pneumonia. Her name had been Nora. She was 8, bright, curious, always asking why the wind howled. Her mother stopped speaking for a week after the funeral. The doctor had tried, but there wasn't much he could do. He said her lungs looked like they'd been filled with cement. The dust was too fine. It slipped past cloth masks, curtains, even the smallest cracks in the wall. Nora had breathed the prairie into her body until it stopped moving. Her father never plowed again after that. He just sat on the porch and stared at the horizon, shotgun across his knees, waiting for something, anything, to end it. The government sent aid, but it came slow. President Roosevelt's New Deal had brought some hope. The Soil Conservation Service arrived in 1935, teaching farmers how to plant windbreaks and rotate crops. But for most, it was too late. Whole towns disappeared. Banks foreclosed on farms. Families who had lived on the land for generations were evicted overnight, their possessions dumped in the road. Tractors rolled over abandoned homes. Auctioneers sold dreams by the crate. Elsie's neighbors, the Danners, lost their farm in August. Mr. Danner drove his Ford pickup straight into the side of his barn and sat there until his wife found him sobbing. They left that night. Elsie watched their tail lights vanish down the dirt road, swallowed by dust. There was a new name now for the migrants who fled the plains: Okies. It didn't matter if you were from Kansas or Texas or New Mexico. If you came west in a rusted car with everything you owned strapped to the roof, you were an Okie. California didn't want them. Signs in Fresno read, "No jobs for Okies." Sheriffs at state lines turned cars away, and yet thousands came, a river of broken people flowing west, searching for work, for mercy, for something that looked like a future. They lived in cars, tents, and roadside ditches. They sold heirlooms for bread. They buried babies wrapped in newspapers. And still, they came. Elsie's father was one of the few who refused to leave. "I was born on this land," he said. "I'll die here." He was stubborn, proud, but the dust didn't care. In spring 1935, the well went dry. In summer, the last of their cattle dropped dead. And in September, her mother packed their few belongings into a wood-sided wagon. "We'll head for Amarillo," she said. Her father didn't speak. He just nodded. And the next morning, they hitched the last surviving mule and set off. They walked for days. Dust clung to their clothes like a curse. The sun baked their skin. The wagon creaked with every step. They slept beside empty roads, beneath trees that hadn't bloomed in 2 years. In one town, a shopkeeper gave them biscuits. In another, a man threw stones and shouted, "Go back to where you came from." They kept walking. By the time they reached Amarillo, her mother's feet were bleeding, and the mule could barely stand. They were sent to a camp on the edge of the city, rows of tents, some made from grain sacks, others from broken fencing. A man named Mr. Blevins ran the camp. He wore a hat with holes in it and had a soft spot for kids. He gave Elsie her first orange in years. She cried when she ate it. It tasted like sunlight. Life in the camp wasn't easy. They shared a stove with 3 other families. A tub served as a bath, laundry station, and water basin. Flies buzzed constantly, but at least the air was breathable. Her father found work picking cotton. He made 20 cents a day, his hands bleeding from the burrs. Her mother cooked over a fire and taught Elsie how to make a stew from almost nothing. They weren't living, but they weren't dying. That was enough. One afternoon, a man from the Resettlement Administration visited the camp. He was clean-shaven, with kind eyes and a notebook. He asked questions, wrote things down, promised that new homes were being built for Dust Bowl families, places with running water, roofs, even electricity. Most people didn't believe him, but a few did. And when the offer came in November, Elsie's family took it. They were moved to a small homestead on government land. 3 rooms, a new well, and a vegetable garden. It wasn't the prairie, but it was a start. Years later, Elsie would write about those days. She would become a teacher, a writer. She'd marry a boy she met in the Amarillo camp and name her first daughter Nora, after the neighbor's child who had died from dust. She would tell her students, "We weren't just covered in dirt, we were covered in sorrow." But we survived, and survival is a kind of victory. The Dust Bowl had stolen land, lives, and entire towns, but not the will to keep going. And in that cracked earth, amid the despair, something stubborn and sacred endured, something that refused to blow away. Lawrence, Massachusetts, January 1933. The bitter cold gnawed at exposed skin and seeped into every thread of clothing. But the people of Lawrence had grown accustomed to fighting against more than just weather. For years, they had endured poverty, hunger, and exploitation. Now, as the Great Depression tightened its grip, their struggle took on a new urgency. On the dimly lit floor of a crowded union hall, a young woman named Rosa Martinez stood among a sea of faces, mill workers, garment workers, and families who had come to demand something simple: dignity. Rosa was 19. Her fingers bore the scars of years of sewing in cramped factories. She had grown up in a family of immigrants, her parents having crossed the ocean seeking a better life. But better had not yet arrived. Her voice trembled as she spoke. They cut our hours, but not our rent. They lower our pay, but expect us to work harder. We are the hands that make the clothes that keep others warm, but we shiver in cold rooms and go hungry. This must stop. The hall erupted in cheers. The Lawrence textile mills had once been the backbone of the town, pumping out yards of fabric day and night. But with the Depression came wage cuts, layoffs, and longer hours for those who remained. Families survived on pennies. Children left school to help at home. Mothers went hungry so their babies could eat. Rosa's mother, Lucia, worked 2 jobs, one in the mills, another cleaning houses, just to keep food on the table. Rosa herself had just lost a week's wages when the mill shortened shifts to save money. But there was something new stirring, something fierce. Across America, workers were rising. Strikes flared up in factories from Detroit to Pittsburgh, in coal mines in Appalachia, and in shipyards along the West Coast. Labor unions, long suppressed, found new energy under the leadership of activists who believed the time for change was now. They chanted slogans like "Bread and Roses," a call not only for fair wages, but for a life with dignity, respect, and hope. Rosa carried that slogan in her heart. She and her friends organized sit-ins, picket lines, and marches. They wrote letters to newspapers, held meetings in basements and churches, and spoke to anyone who would listen. Her brother Antonio, a strong and quiet man, took the lead in coordinating the strike at the mill where they both worked. January 1933 was bitter cold. The mill owners refused to budge. Workers were locked out. But Rosa and the others held firm. They stood on picket lines day after day, the snow crunching beneath their feet. They sang songs that told of struggle and survival. They shared what little food they had: stale bread, boiled potatoes, thin soup. The city watched. Some neighbors sympathized. Others called them troublemakers. One day, a group of scabs tried to cross the line. Rosa faced them, clutching a wooden sign. "We don't want to fight you," she said quietly. "We just want to work and live." The scabs sneered and pushed forward, but Rosa's courage held the line. In the mills, production ground to a halt. Orders were delayed. Money flowed slower. The pressure mounted. Finally, after 3 weeks, the mill owners agreed to negotiations. It was a victory, not total, but real. Wages were restored, hours improved, and the workers won official recognition of their union. The strike inspired others. In factories across the nation, men and women stood up. They demanded fair treatment. They demanded a voice. And slowly, the country began to listen. Rosa's story was repeated thousands of times in the factories of Detroit, the docks of San Francisco, the coal mines of West Virginia. The Great Depression was not only a time of despair, It was a time of resistance, of courage, of hope. Years later, Rosa would remember that winter as the moment she truly understood what it meant to fight for justice. She would marry Antonio and raise children who learned to stand up for themselves. She would teach them to never accept less than they deserved. Because during the darkest of times, the people had learned a simple truth. They were worth more than bread. They deserved roses too. Chicago, Illinois, November 1932. The streets were alive with whispers and murmurs of hope. Posters of a smiling man with a confident gaze were plastered on every corner, their vibrant blue eyes a stark contrast to the gray skies and worn faces of the city's weary inhabitants. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. To many, he was a beacon, someone who promised more than words, someone who promised action. Among those who watched closely was Joseph Kane, a factory worker who had lost his job the previous year. Joseph was a man shaped by hardship, calloused hands, tired eyes, and a heart heavy with the weight of a family who depended on him. He stood at the window of their small apartment on the south side, watching the cold rain slick the sidewalks below. His wife, Mary, prepared dinner with the little they had, a pot of watery stew simmering on the stove. Their two children sat quietly, listening to the radio broadcast announcing Roosevelt's latest speech. I promise you, Roosevelt's voice boomed through the static, a new deal for the American people. We will bring relief, recovery, and reform. Joseph clenched his fists. He believed it. He had to. The election campaign had been a whirlwind of rallies, speeches, and promises. Hoover, the incumbent president, seemed distant, clinging to outdated policies and empty reassurances. Roosevelt, on the other hand, radiated optimism, a stark contrast to the despair etched into every wrinkle and smile line of the nation. On election night, Joseph and his family gathered around their battered radio. The results came slowly at first, then with increasing certainty. Roosevelt was winning, decisively. Joseph felt a surge of hope he hadn't experienced in years. The weeks that followed were electric with possibility. Roosevelt's inaugural address captured the imagination of millions. Our greatest primary task, he declared, is to put people to work, relief for those who suffer, recovery for the economy, and reform to prevent a future depression. Joseph watched as the government rolled out programs designed to revive the nation. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, the Public Works Administration, PWA, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, began hiring unemployed men and women, putting them to work, building dams, roads, and parks. His brother Michael found employment with the CCC, sent to plant trees and build trails in the Appalachian Mountains. Joseph himself secured a job through the Works Progress Administration, WPA, repairing streets and bridges in Chicago. Life was far from easy, but it was better than before. Mary no longer had to pawn their wedding dishes to buy bread. Their children could attend school without fear of being sent home hungry. For the first time in years, the future seemed less like a dark tunnel and more like a path forward. But change was not without resistance. Some businessmen derided Roosevelt's programs as socialism and government overreach. The Supreme Court struck down several New Deal initiatives, declaring them unconstitutional. Yet Roosevelt pressed on. He understood that hope was more than a word. It was a fire that needed to be kept burning. At a rally in Grant Park, Joseph stood shoulder to shoulder with thousands of others, holding a sign that read, "Jobs, Justice, and a New Deal." The crowd erupted as Roosevelt took the stage. Joseph felt the warmth of belonging, of purpose. For the first time since the Depression began, he believed that America could heal. In the years that followed, Roosevelt's New Deal reshaped the country. Social security was born, labor rights were protected, the economy slowly revived. And though the road was long and the challenges great, the fires of change kindled a new era. Joseph's journal from those days was filled with entries about hope, struggle, and perseverance. November 10th, 1932. Today, we chose hope. I can see it in Mary's eyes and in the laughter of the children. It's a new dawn. May 3rd, 1933. Started work on the new bridge. It's hard labor, but it's honest. I feel alive again. June 22nd, 1935. The city is changing. People smile more. The streets are cleaner. The future is uncertain, but at least it's ours to shape. And as Joseph walked home one evening, beneath the flickering street lamps, he whispered a quiet prayer. Thank you, Mr. President, for giving us the courage to believe again. Detroit, Michigan, winter, 1934. The snow fell softly outside the weathered windows of a small, dimly lit apartment. Inside, Thomas Grady sat in silence, staring at a photograph of his wife and 2 children. The edges were curled. The image faded. A family once whole, now fractured by the relentless grip of the Depression. Thomas was a man who had known better days. Once a proud factory foreman, he had lost his job 2 years ago when the plant shuttered. Since then, his pride had been chipped away by months of unemployment, mounting bills, and the gnawing hunger that echoed through his stomach each night. He ran his hands through his thinning hair and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of despair settle upon him like a shroud. Outside, the city was a sprawling graveyard of closed factories and empty streets. The roar of machinery had been replaced by silence. Families huddled around meager fires, praying for warmth, for food, for hope. But for some, the darkness was too deep. Suicide rates had skyrocketed. Men who could no longer bear the shame of failure took their own lives in alleys, in homes, on factory floors. Women despaired in isolation. Children went hungry, their eyes too large for their sunken faces. Thomas had come close more than once. One bitter January night, after a day spent searching for work that didn't exist, Thomas found himself on the edge of the riverbank, staring into the freezing water below. His fingers trembled as he clutched a scrap of paper, an eviction notice. He thought of his children's faces, the way his wife's eyes lit up when he promised better days. And then he heard a voice, a soft, insistent whisper from the darkness. Hold on. It was a memory, a fragment of a sermon from years before, a promise that even in the darkest times, light could be found. Thomas stepped back. That night marked the turning point. He sought out help, a rare and difficult choice. Churches opened their doors to those in need. Charitable organizations provided counseling and food. Neighborhood groups formed to support the vulnerable. Thomas began attending meetings at the local YMCA, where men gathered to share their struggles and their stories. He met others like him, broken but unbowed. Among them was Sarah Jenkins, a nurse who had lost her husband to the Depression and now worked tirelessly to aid the destitute. Sarah spoke of resilience, of hope, of the strength that could be found in community. Together, they organized food drives, clothing swaps, and job training sessions. Meanwhile, across the country, countless others grappled with the shadows. In San Francisco, a young woman named Maria Alvarez cared for her aging father and 2 siblings in a cramped apartment. Their landlord had raised the rent, and eviction loomed. Maria took on work as a seamstress, sewing late into the night by candlelight. Her fingers bled, but she refused to give up. One evening, a letter arrived from the Works Progress Administration offering her a job in a city project. It wasn't much pay, but it was enough. her family's faces brightened for the first time in months. In rural Appalachia, the Harrison family survived on wild game and the generosity of neighbors. When the coal mines closed, the men took to hunting and foraging. The women mended clothes and tended small gardens. They shared stories by firelight, tales of better times and dreams of renewal. The youngest, a boy named Eli, wrote in a tattered notebook, "We are poor, but not broken. Our hearts are strong." Back in Detroit, Thomas and Sarah's efforts grew. They founded a community kitchen where volunteers cooked hot meals for those who had none. The lines stretched around the block each evening. At the kitchen, stories flowed, tales of lost jobs, lost homes, lost hope, but also of kindness, courage, and the small victories that kept the darkness at bay. One night, as Thomas handed a bowl of stew to a shivering man, he noticed a glimmer of gratitude in the man's eyes. It reminded him of his own worth, of his own strength. He realized then that survival wasn't just about weathering the storm. It was about helping others find shelter beneath the same roof. The shadows of the Great Depression were long and cold, but within them, the flicker of human spirit refused to be extinguished. And in those flickering flames, the seeds of recovery were planted. Washington, D.C., spring 1936. The city was awakening from the long winter with renewed energy. Workers with calloused hands and determined eyes filled the streets, marching toward new construction sites, factories buzzing with fresh activity, and government offices humming with purpose. Among them was Eleanor Price, a young architect who had struggled to find work since her graduation 3 years earlier. The Depression had nearly crushed her dreams, but now, with the New Deal's ambitious programs, Eleanor found herself at the forefront of a nation rebuilding itself. Eleanor's first assignment was the construction of a new public library, a symbol of hope and knowledge for a city battered by hardship. She poured her soul into the project, sketching designs that combined strength with beauty, spaces that welcomed every citizen, regardless of class or background. On site, she met men like Harold Jenkins, a former coal miner turned construction worker who had lost everything to the Depression. Harold's hands were rough but skilled, his spirit rekindled by the chance to build something lasting. Together, they watched the skeleton of steel rise against the sky, each beam a testament to perseverance. Across the country, similar projects were underway. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, was transforming the landscape, building dams, generating electricity, and creating jobs in the rural South. Towns, once dark and poor, began to hum with new life. In California, the Golden Gate Bridge was taking shape, a bold statement of American ingenuity and determination. Roads, schools, parks, and airports sprouted up from the dust and rubble, paid for by the millions in New Deal funds. In the Midwest, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, employed thousands, including many women and minorities previously excluded from such opportunities. They built murals, theaters, and public buildings, bringing culture and pride back to forgotten communities. Among the artists was James Walker, an African-American painter who had faced discrimination, but now found his voice celebrated in government-sponsored projects. His murals told stories of struggle and triumph, images of workers, families, and the American landscape reborn. Eleanor often visited these projects, carrying her blueprint roll and sketch pad. She believed architecture was more than buildings. It was about restoring dignity and hope. She remembered the faces of families she had met during her years of unemployment, their eyes hollow, their voices quiet. Now, those eyes sparkled with possibility. In her journal, Eleanor wrote, April 14, 1936, Today I saw a child run through the half-finished library, laughing. It reminded me why I fight so hard. For moments like these. For futures not yet written. The nation's infrastructure was not the only thing being rebuilt. Communities came together to support each other. Farmers shared seeds. Neighbors built code playgrounds for children. And churches opened their doors as centers of aid. The government's Social Security Act, passed in 1935, promised a safety net for the elderly and unemployed, easing fears of poverty. Labor unions gained strength, winning better wages and protections. In the small town of Millville, Pennsylvania, a factory reopened under a New Deal program. The owner, Mr. Whitman, had once resisted labor reforms but now worked with union leaders to ensure fair treatment. At the reopening ceremony, workers like Anna Russo, a single mother of 3, cheered with tears in their eyes. For Anna, the factory meant more than income. It meant stability, dignity, and hope for her children. Yet the road was not without obstacles. Opponents of the New Deal continued to challenge reforms. The Supreme Court ruled some programs unconstitutional, and political battles raged. But Roosevelt remained steadfast, rallying the nation with speeches that called for unity and perseverance. By 1937, signs of recovery were evident. Unemployment had dropped, factories hummed, the stock market was more stable, but the lessons of the Depression lingered. Eleanor, Harold, Anna, and millions like them knew the future depended on vigilance. One evening, as Eleanor stood on the steps of the new library, watching the sunset cast golden light over the city, she felt a quiet pride. America was being rebuilt, not just its buildings and roads, but its spirit. And though scars remained, the nation was stronger. Washington, D.C., September 1939. The world was unraveling once again. On the polished mahogany desk of the Oval Office, a map of Europe lay spread, red and black ink, tracing the borders, the shifting front lines, and the ominous advance of armies. Franklin D. Roosevelt sat behind his desk, his hands folded, gaze fixed on the flickering radio beside him. The news crackled to life. Germany had launched a massive invasion of Poland. Britain and France declared war. The continent was once more engulfed in flames. For millions of Americans, the storm brewing overseas felt distant and abstract. Yet beneath the surface, a profound unease stirred. A feeling that history was repeating itself, that the scars of the Great Depression had not fully healed, and that the fragile peace might soon shatter. In a modest home on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio, James Caldwell adjusted the collar of his worn jacket, trying to steady his trembling hands. The radio blared news updates as he sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by his family. His father, once a proud steelworker, had been laid off for nearly 4 years. His mother patched worn clothes and rationed the meager groceries carefully. James was 22, the eldest of 5 siblings, and the recent recipient of a factory job making automobile parts, work he'd thought impossible to find in the depths of the Depression. But now, with war threatening overseas, his factory had been repurposed to manufacture military equipment, tanks, rifles, aircraft parts. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, pride that he could contribute to his country's defense, yet dread at the growing likelihood that he, too, might be sent to fight. The Depression had shaped James's entire worldview. He remembered the cold winters when the coal in the furnace ran out, the hunger that gnawed at his younger brothers and sisters, and the uncertainty that gripped every household. Years had passed, but the shadow of poverty lingered. Neighbors talked in hushed voices about the rise of fascism in Europe, about the lessons the country should have learned from its own struggles. The debates over intervention or isolationism filled the newspapers and dinner tables. James's mother, a quiet woman with steel in her eyes, often whispered, "We've suffered enough. God willing, this won't drag us back into another nightmare." Across the country, in New York City, Margaret Ellis packed a small leather bag with essentials. A nurse at Bellevue Hospital, she had worked through some of the darkest days of the Depression, caring for the sick and wounded, often with scant supplies. She had seen families torn apart by disease and despair, children whose futures were stolen by poverty. Now, with war looming, Margaret was determined to volunteer for overseas service. It was not just duty, it was a calling. Her hands trembled as she folded a worn photograph of her late father, a World War I veteran who had died broken and forgotten. "I will not let his sacrifice be in vain," she whispered to herself. Meanwhile, in rural Arkansas, the Johnson family gathered around a kerosene lamp, listening intently to the radio broadcasts. The eldest son, Samuel, had recently returned from a New Deal public works project where he helped build roads and bridges, work that had given him hope and purpose after years of hardship. Samuel had watched neighbors lose farms to foreclosure, friends vanish westward as migrants in search of work, and families break under the pressure of survival. Yet in the government programs, he saw a spark, a chance to rebuild not just roads, but lives. Now, hearing of the war in Europe, he felt the tug of duty alongside the desire to protect his family and the country that had begun to heal. Back in Washington, Roosevelt convened with advisors, balancing the demands of domestic recovery and the international crisis. The New Deal had wrought remarkable change. The Civilian Conservation Corps had planted billions of trees. The Works Progress Administration had employed millions in infrastructure projects, and Social Security had begun to offer a safety net to the elderly and unemployed. But the economy remained fragile, and the military woefully underprepared. Roosevelt understood the delicate dance, preparing the nation for the possibility of war without plunging it into conflict prematurely. Factories, from Detroit to Los Angeles, shifted gears. Automobile plants transformed into tank assembly lines. Aircraft manufacturing soared. Shipyards worked around the clock. James Caldwell's factory increased production. He labored long hours, the noise deafening, the work grueling but necessary. For many, these jobs were lifelines, restoring pride and providing income for families on the brink. The American public's mood was complex. Isolationists argued fiercely for staying out of European affairs, fearing another devastating war. Others, including many veterans of World War I, urged for preparedness and intervention if necessary. Public opinion polls showed a country torn between fear and resolve. In New York, Margaret Ellis received her deployment orders. She bid farewell to her mother and siblings with tears and hope. Her heart was heavy with the uncertainty ahead, but steeled by determination. On the voyage across the Atlantic, she met nurses and soldiers, each with their own story of loss and courage. They shared whispered fears of the conflict awaiting them and dreams of peace. In small towns like James's, community meetings were held to discuss civil defense and preparedness. Air raid drills were practiced, rationing plans drawn. Churches organized support groups for families of servicemen. Amidst this preparation, the economy began to show stronger signs of recovery. Unemployment fell steadily. Consumer goods returned to shelves. Yet the specter of war cast a long shadow. James received his draft notice in late 1940. The day was heavy with emotion. His mother cried openly. His father nodded with stoic pride. As he packed his belongings, the weight of history pressed upon him. He thought of his factory work, the New Deal programs that had put food on his table, and the friends who had not survived the Depression. He vowed to carry their spirit forward. Margaret's nursing unit was soon deployed to England, where she witnessed the horrors of war firsthand: the bombing raids, the shattered cities, the wounded soldiers. Yet amid destruction, she found moments of humanity, laughter shared between comrades, acts of kindness, the resilience of civilians determined to endure. Back home, families like the Caldwells kept the home fires burning. Women took on new roles in factories and offices. Children adapted to rationing and uncertainty. The nation was changing, its people forged by hardship, ready to face whatever came next. In Washington, Roosevelt's fireside chats grew more frequent and urgent. He spoke directly to Americans, urging vigilance, sacrifice, and unity. "Let us not forget the lessons of the past," he said. "Our recovery is fragile, but our resolve must be firm. Together, we will meet the trials ahead." As autumn deepened, James boarded a train bound for basic training. He looked out at the fading countryside, feeling the pulse of a nation at a crossroads. Margaret, on a hospital ship bound for the front, clutched her medical bag and a small photograph of her father. Both carried the burdens of the past and hopes for the future. The Great Depression was not yet over, but a new chapter had begun. The winds of war were fierce and uncertain, but the spirit forged in the years of hardship gave America strength, a strength that would be tested like never before.